Okay, thank you very much, everyone. I hope you all have had a good conference so far. This is our closing program. I wanted to thank you for all of you for hanging in there and spread the word. Keep the momentum going because the momentum is definitely strong, and we look forward to continued growth. And we look forward to each one of you and your colleagues being here next year as well. So one of the major messages I'd say that we all can take from this convening is the importance and the value of community and collaboration. We know that we, as individual organizations, even small groups, can't do this alone. And we've spoken through the week about the importance of getting employers to the table and having the employment voice be part of the discussion. It's a very important component. So I'm very pleased to announce that Dr. Alex Alonso is here to speak about the Society of HR Management's research in this and related fields. So would you all please welcome Alex Alonso.
Thank you all, and thank you, Mark. If there's any consolation, I'll never forget I had a phone call with Mark, and he said to me, we'd really love to know what it is that employers are thinking about skills-based hiring in particular, competency-based education, and alternate credentialing or alternative credentialing. And I thought to myself, geez, how fortuitous, and oh God, are we gonna run into a big mess here? Because we talked a lot about collaboration this week, and one of the things that stands out to me is, what do you do when you are asked to collaborate with someone who is not interested in being collaborative? And for the sake of being slanderous for a moment and somewhat blasphemous, I'll share with you that coming from the HR profession and being part of the HR profession and representing the HR profession, one of the things that strikes me is we are not a particularly collaborative and warm bunch, right? How many of you have ever had a warm experience with HR? Probably not. Oh, okay, somebody back there. Well, good. I'm happy to hear that. I'll find the other person in the million that I've interviewed that will convene notes or share notes. So one of the things that strikes me is, and part of what really enthused me about this is thanks to a grant by Walmart Foundation and then additional support from Charles Koch Foundation, we've been able to study this particular work. But one of the things that strikes me is I want to kind of get to the frame of mind where we're sharing what it is that employers are actually thinking and doing when given the opportunity to engage in skills-based hiring, or more importantly, to hire based upon a variety of different qualifications. Things that indicate competency and proficiency beyond what it is that we think of when we think of the standard traditional credential, which is the degree. So at this point, this is where my wife says that I'm either going to bore you or depress you. So please know that my aim is not to depress you. So with that in mind, I'll share with you that the big picture, and this should come as no surprise to anyone, what it is that employers are dealing with. And I'll make my slides available. My email is real easy. Anybody who has any interest, you can just write me at knowledge@shrm.org. It's a lot easier than remembering my name. So with that in mind, what I'll share with you is, when you think about what it is that employers are experiencing on the whole, right? The very first thing you think about is large-scale talent shortages, right? Large-scale talent shortages. And specifically, they stem from any one of four sources. The first is really that we're running into lingering effects of COVID-19. It's still happening, obviously, the pandemic is still ongoing, but what we see over and over again is there is a drop in labor participation rates across the board. And it's not just because of the pandemic, it's because of the way we responded to the pandemic. So you heard Amber reference, for instance, policy. And one of the things that we've seen over the course of time is there is a growing number of people who were employed who then ended up unemployed and now are choosing not to go back after having been employed. We hear the big stat all the time, which is the 12 million jobs that are available and the 12 million jobs that are out there that need to be filled. But what we don't hear about is the 4 million people who are saying, I am better off staying home and on unemployment or on PPP programs than I am on towards going back, or worse yet, towards getting reskilled and accepting federal dollars to do that. That's a jarring statistic when you think about that. That is something that speaks to an issue that we have now sort of underwritten as an economy and as a nation. In addition, we are also seeing lingering effects of the workplace. How many of you, by show of hands, are working outside your traditional workplace, outside the office still? A good number of you. And how many of you actually enjoy it? Okay, a good number of you. You'll be surprised. The average working American, 61% of them actually want to go back to the office. You don't hear that often. We are a unique subset of the overall population, right? Most of us are in the knowledge sector. Most of us are in the professional services sector. And we make up about 38% of the overall economy. But that other 62% does not include professionals who are like us. They don't have the opportunity or the ease with which they can perform their jobs in the workplace the way we can, or outside the workplace the way we can. And so we see this recurring over and over again, where there is this battle between culture and what organizational culture means, but also what the workplace means. And it recurs over and over and over again. Now, what we see also is that the employer's role has shifted. Employers are now counted upon to play the role of both caregiver and also employer, also the person who's responsible for both mental wellness as well as mental welfare, responsible for health, responsible for subsidies, responsible for a variety of other things. In fact, in many cases, we see now employees or potential workers are seeing that they expect their employers to do more for them than their government in many cases. And if you had gone back 100 years ago, that would not have been the case. It would have been the exact opposite. Now, the last thing I'll share with you, though, is we're seeing misalignment in terms of what it is that employees versus employers need. And what I mean by that both is in terms of learning needs, but also in terms of what it is that we're doing to educate a variety of different workers. And what we're doing in terms of educating and helping people achieve what it is that we want to achieve for our employment perspective. This misalignment continues to create this big churn. So how does this manifest itself? I'm assuming all of you now want a career in HR, right? Because you get to deal with this, and this is a wonderful thing, right? You get to deal with all this joyousness. No, in reality, what it boils down to is we have a talent shortage. We have people who are not easily linking themselves to employers despite the desire and the need and the opportunity to do so. And so it manifests itself in that, but it also manifests itself in a variety of different behaviors, both from employers, but more importantly, from the profession that is responsible for sourcing the talent and making sure the talent is developed as well as it should be. I'll share with you a couple things. More often than not, when I poll HR professionals and hiring managers, I ask them to describe for me the talent shortage that they run into today and what it is that they look for in terms of the skills that they're looking for. How do they shop for these skills? What does the ecosystem look like for them? And more often than not, I put up this picture and they say to me, it's definitely not the messy side. It's the mess. It's that giant disaster over there that looks like it should be on hoarders. I don't know what this ecosystem looks like, and I can't find a solution to help me tackle it from all angles, right? I can't find that opportunity to do that. The hard part, though, cognitively speaking, is when you are over on the right-hand side of this, I, as a psychologist, can tell you what's the number one thing that you're going to do. You're going to want to sweep it under the rug and look for a solution to cover it up, as opposed to actually tackling that problem, as opposed to pushing forth in that problem. And if you walk away with anything here today, it is not what the technology needs are. It is not what it is that you can do to support or build better competency-based education. It is literally learning how to talk to HR professionals. If you walk away with anything, it is understanding what it is you do to engage those very professionals who will ultimately be your end users or your consumers. And note that I use those words. Note that I use those words. So I promised you that I wasn't trying to depress you, but maybe I lied a little bit. And so we talk about this cataclysm of five forces that are out there, these things that are creating that skills kind of crater, as I like to think of it, because a gap would be too easy, but beyond that, I think that we're seeing a dearth in what it is that it means to be proficient. It's not just that we don't have the skills, it's also not, now we're losing sight of the definition. So the hole is getting deeper. And one of the things that I think we see is that employers as a whole hunt for way too many bespoke solutions. More often than not, we want bespoke solutions because I have that one key problem, or I have that one problem set that makes my life difficult right now and isn't really tied to how I get to a bigger, broader solution, a strategic solution. The other thing that we see, though, is, and things that are making this worse is, if I were to ask you, where do you think learning budgets are amongst employers today? Where do you think they are? Are they up from what they were in 2019? Down? What do you think? Globally, they are up nearly 41%. Up nearly 41%. And I'll share with you, we at SHRM have access to about 1 million workplaces worldwide, and we work with over about 1.6 million HR professionals just in the US alone. And I'll share with you that they're up about 41%. So why is it not working? Why do we still have talent gaps? What's that? You're absolutely right. The question was why, and you're saying we weren't training the right things, right? The other thing that we're seeing, though, is we're throwing money into that skills crater, right? We're throwing money at it as opposed to trying to find the right solution or the right problem. I'll share with you, 2 weeks ago, I was speaking at a CEO group of the 65 largest engineering firms on the planet. And they were trying to figure out issues around mental health and supporting mental health and empathy in their workplaces. And I couldn't hold myself from thinking of the approach that I needed to give them, but the answer was, please stop trying to over-engineer the solution, right? And that really went over really well in a room full of engineers, but the answer was, don't over-engineer the solution sometimes. Stop, think, and actually act against what will make some difference. And when you think specifically about how it is that that really impacts what we're doing from the employer perspective, it helps us reduce waste as employers. And more often than not, that's what employers are most interested in, is not just generating productivity, but it's how do we reduce waste. And the problem is, we as employers have a tendency to try anything. And I'll share with you 3 things that I've seen as people try to bridge this skills gap and this talent shortage. 3 things that I think are interesting, but I'll share with you are sort of scary across the board. Number 1, we're seeing that people are actually upping what it is that they pay individuals. So they're upping it, and it's close to, in terms of recruitment budgets, we're seeing that the increase is close to 6 to 11%, depending upon the size of your organization. What's more intriguing about that, though, is where it's being spent. When running into talent shortages, and specifically skills shortages, what people are doing is actually paying somebody else to do the work for them. So what they're doing is they're actually creating boomeranger bonuses. How many of you have heard of boomeranger bonuses? Well, boomeranger bonuses mean that I'm going to pay you if you've left, but what I'm going to do is hire someone else who knows you really well to convince you to come back, but I'm going to hire that person using a bonus. I'm going to give them a bonus to say, please help me bring this person back. It's a peer pressure bonus. It's a peer pressure bonus. You've been gone for 6 months, and now I'm going to go ahead and try to lure you back. It's interesting. It actually works in many cases. It depends on the industry, but it does work. We're also seeing specifically that other groups are doing something completely different. They're dropping all kinds of assessments, every assessment imaginable, to determine whether or not someone is the right fit for the organization or has the skills needed to do this work. That's pretty scary to me, because that basically renders us all obsolete, right? It's the notion that, in essence, I'm going to go ahead and just bring in warm bodies and we'll let it sort itself out. That's not an appropriate approach in my mind, especially being an IO psychologist and being a staunch defender of our industry for the last 115 years. In addition, though, what I'm finding more interesting, though, is there's the majority of employers who are actually now turning to this notion of skills-based hiring. They are actually saying, we believe in skills-based hiring. More than 70% of employers are actually thinking they believe in skills-based hiring. Here's the problem. Ask them to define skills-based hiring. And more often than not, when you get to employers, they cannot do it. They cannot do it. What's even scarier, though, is when you get to HR professionals and hiring managers and talent acquisition professionals, what percentage of them do you think can actually define skills-based hiring the right way? It's less than 7%. Less than 7%. That's like going to a chef and asking him to define chicken, right? And they can't define chicken. That's pretty bad. That's pretty bad. But the good news is at least they're invested in it. They're understanding that it's something out there and that it could potentially help them. So there is a silver lining. What we do find, though, is more often than not, when an employer or an HR professional is thinking about skills-based hiring, what they're thinking about is an alternate demonstration of skill or proficiency in some way, shape, or form, or what they like to call alternate credentials. And what we've seen over the course of the last 10 years is that alternate credentials have actually exploded, not just in terms of the sheer magnitude. The last time I looked at this and participated in a survey from Jason Tishko and the folks over at the U.S. Chamber, we had over 1.7 million different credentials out there, alternates included. But one of the things that stood out to me was we had maybe, at that point, it was about 18% of workers who held some sort of alternate credential. Now it's up to 31%. It's up to 31%. That's almost a full third of the work population, which is a telling sign. Unfortunately, it's not perfect, though, because who do you think the biggest consumers of alternate credentials are? People who already have a master's degree. 100%. In fact, 68% of the people who have an alternate credential have an advanced degree in some way. So it's not, as my accounting friends would like to say, it's not something that is accretive in any way, shape, or form. We're actually just cannibalizing the same pool of people. So think about this as you think about what it is that HR professionals are consuming here. They're saying, I think of skills-based hiring as something that's valuable, but they're also then turning and saying, when I think of skills-based hiring, what I'm thinking about is alternate credentials, but when I get alternate credentials, what am I looking at? I'm typically looking at an overqualified candidate, somebody who's got qualifications beyond what we're looking for. And that warps the way that HR professionals and employers look at skills-based hiring. It warps the way we do that. I'll share with you that it wasn't enough for me to, when we looked at this work, it wasn't enough for me to think about HR professionals alone. One of the things that stood out to me specifically was we hear often about the HR professional is the problem. It's too easy to say that, right? That's the lazy approach. But what about hiring managers? What about executives who are responsible for the work that we talk about when we're talking about skills-based hiring? How many of them actually are consumers of alternate credentials or even consider it when they're thinking about the kind of employment decisions that they think about? And what was surprising to us is there was a significant part of the population that understood that these are things to be considered when thinking about looking for skills equivalents, looking for things that are beyond what it is that you would look at just from the university that somebody went to and got their degree. In fact, we saw that about 90% of executives felt that this was something that they would consider when making a decision about their immediate direct reports. We also saw specifically that 91% of hiring managers said that they consider this for every job. This is something that is part of every job decision that they make. And then sadly, the HR profession was bringing up the rear, no surprise. And one of the things that stood out was only 77% of them said this was an alternate credential was something that they used as a qualification when thinking about what they do for making decisions for screening purposes and for sourcing purposes. All this to say, everybody kind of knows what it is or understands to some degree what alternate credentials are, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we know what we're doing with them, right? It's sort of like having being that kid in the candy shop which says, I love all the candy, but I don't know what I'm doing with it in any way, shape, or form. And Mark, if you sneeze again, I'm gonna say bless you infinity like we say in my household. We took a step back and we started to define what is value when you think about these kinds of things. What is it that value means when you're thinking about the kind of alternate credentials that are out there? And we asked all three groups, what is it that you think is the best indicator of skills proficiency out there? What is that alternate credential that is most meaningful to you? And no surprise, the number one thing that everybody agrees upon is an industry or professional certification. Now, I am the executive responsible for the 11th largest professional certification program on the planet, but I will tell you this stunned me. This stunned me because more often than not, what we are saying is those industry or professional certifications are based upon what? An understood body of knowledge or framework that speaks to this is the standard of competencies that we need. These are the proficiencies that we need. But there is a large majority of professional and industry certification programs that do not have that. That do not have that. And I mean close to 80% that don't. That is sort of jarring to me because what we're saying is if SHRM says this is good, that means it's a proxy for good. Or, and I'm saying SHRM because I don't want to slander anybody else, but if agency says this is good, this is what it is. Well, that's great, but where's the nuts and bolts, the guts behind it? And to me, that matters in large part because the nuts and bolts, the guts behind it, are what we use to crosswalk skills from that credential holder to the job itself, to the qualifications needed to perform that job. So interestingly enough, it was great to see that this was the number one factor that people considered in alternate credentials, but in reality, it was a little scary too. It was a little scary. We also then see some divergence when we look at what it is that people consider after that. Without question, there are things like training certificates and course completion certificates that play an important role. More so for executives and hiring managers, your operators, than it does for HR professionals. What stands out there for HR professionals? It's the virtual events, right? It's the virtual badge. But the virtual badge with what? You have to have shown something, right? So right away, HR professionals are sort of sharing with you what it is that they do and what they think. I remember a study that I worked on years ago, back in 2009 and 2010, where I was hired to look at competency-based education for the HR profession, which had none to that point. And I'll never forget, one of the things that stood out to me was they themselves have real tendencies. The HR profession has real tendencies. They love lectures. They don't like group projects. They don't want to engage in practical work or practical application. Apprenticeships, they didn't exist before 2020 in HR. Think about that. Internships, yeah, everybody says they want one, but they don't really want one, right? So that experiential learning component that most people crave, that we rave about, is counter to the DNA of the HR professional. And yet the HR professional is one of the three big consumers that we're talking about when it comes to what we produce from that experiential learning. So think about that. You're trying to get somebody to buy a Mercedes and they've been a BMW person their whole life and their dad worked for BMW and their mom worked for VW, but not Mercedes. It's just impossible, right? You're not going to get them to buy a Mercedes. It just doesn't work. And these indicate where they place their value annotations against, right? This is where they go to. This is what they ascribe value against. And these are how they make decisions. It creates a little bit of a problem for us, but it also shines light on a different problem, which is that we say the employer community, but are we being accurate when we say the employer community? No, because what ends up happening is You have 3 distinct groups that actually make up the employer community. I can't tell you the number of times that I've gone to an event like this. Pete, I see you all the time at these events. Jason, I mentioned him, I see him at all these events. Scott Cheney, I've seen you at all these events. And what ends up happening is we end up running into the same thing over and over again, which is we talk about the employer community, but we're only talking about 1/3 of the employer community and their perspective. We're not talking about it in the right way. And so it calls upon us to actually reframe the way we think about this and to reframe what success looks like when we're talking about employers. I'll share with you that employers on the whole really do put some stock in alternate credentials and using it as a proxy for skills equivalence. What we see over and over again, though, is that execs have a tendency to really put it at the top of the list, right? When you look at the top 6 things that they look at, it's number 6. But when compared to HR professionals, they list it, if you were to ask them about the top 15 things that could be there, HR professionals are gonna list it at the 11th, right? But the thing that I walk away with here is it never surpasses things like experience, education, work history. It never surpasses anything that has to do with interview performance. And it never surpasses anything that has to do with a person's just general listed competencies. We have a question, go ahead. Or are you taking a picture? I'm sorry, no. I thought you had the microphone for some reason. Okay, this is telling, right? This is telling because no matter how hard we try, and when we want to identify how it is that skills can be translatable or transportable, this is still how people are thinking about them on the whole, and especially the decision makers. This is how they're deriving this. This is how they produce their decisions. What's worse is we actually took our research and said, you know what, it's time for SHRM to have a little bit of skin in this game as well. So let's actually do we did a quasi-experiment. And we basically listed out for 10,000 HR professionals and for 1,000 hiring managers and for 1,000 execs, we asked them specifically, what would happen if you were given the opportunity to determine whether or not somebody with this credential was qualified? We said, okay, it's not a SHRM study, you don't know where it's coming from, it's blind. Let's go ahead and ask you whether or not you're willing to view somebody as qualified if they hold this credential or not. And then we asked them to think about whether or not this person was qualified if they hold this credential in addition to an AA degree or in addition to a bachelor's degree. And what we found repeatedly is the pattern that you see over and over again. They're willing to say that someone with an alternate credential is qualified, but it's magnified almost exponentially by the fact that they hold a college degree or by the fact that they hold an associate's degree. So you see it over and over again. What determines whether or not they're saying something is qualified is really about the collective addition of an alternate credential as opposed to the alternate credential itself, which is a problem, right? Because we view it and we consume it in the way that people view and consume the side or the side dish that you might get at a restaurant as opposed to the main course, right? And there's no secret I'm talking about food. I've got my COVID 45 on, but what ends up happening out is really people are consuming, and really the people who are supposed to be consuming this over and over again are doing this in a way that isn't conducive to what we're trying to accomplish. It just isn't conducive to what we want to accomplish. What's worse, though, is we actually put them to the test and said, are you willing to advance this candidate to the next phase in an interview process? So let's say you've seen this person, their resume, or you've seen their interoperable learning record, or you've seen their qualifications. What do you do when presented with this notion of they have an alternate credential and they just don't push them forward? They just don't push them forward. And if they do push them forward, it is based on the quality associated with that particular credential. So if I say to you, a senior project manager is more likely to be pushed forward, what do you think that credential was, that alternate credential? It was a PMP, right? It was project management professional. That's what people do, is they take it and ascribe quality based upon how well something is known. It is not on whether or not it actually produces proficiency. That was what we learned more than anything else. And what's troubling is people are being screened out despite the fact that we say we love alternate credentials. You saw that people list them, that they think about them. But what's telling is they don't actually act upon it. They don't move it forward. So how do we get them to change? What do we get them to do? Well, when we ask people specifically, what are your core obstacles? What are the obstacles you run into when thinking about this? It's a lot of the same things that you all have been talking about for the last 20 years. What does it mean when you tell me that this person has that credential versus that credential? What's the variability? How do I know what goes into it? What is it that it means to have this credential versus that credential? There's literally over 1 million credentials out there. Badges, all different kinds of things to indicate some sort of skill. How do I disentangle that? What do I do? In addition, we see that there is a lack of evaluation guidance. And this is from the mouths of hiring managers, talent acquisition professionals, and HR professionals. They don't have the guidance they need to do any kind of understanding or disentangling around what these skills are or what skills are presented when tied to these credentials. And then the last thing is, how do I have any proof that somebody has actually gained the skills proficiency? You heard Amber talk about that when she was talking about the competency-based education network. How do I have proof? What do I know is true versus not true? What is my true north? And these are the things that people continue to run into when thinking about these kinds of decisions. So what do? Well, we actually got to the point where we decided we were going to go ahead and put together an advisory circular. When I was at AIR, one of the things that I worked on specifically was teaching air traffic controllers to pay attention to what they needed to pay attention to, right? If you ask an air traffic controller, the only thing they need to pay attention to is their cathode ray tube, right? That's the only thing they need to pay attention to. But in reality, there was training that was coming up over and over again to help them rethink the way that they were doing their jobs. There was a big next-gen movement in the FAA, and it was unbelievable how hard it was to get them to budge to do some actual learning or to change their practices. It was only coupled or made, the only time I ever experienced anything worse was when trying to train surgeons how to be better team members, and I had a surgeon actually throw a crock at me at the Mayo Clinic once. I'll never forget that. He was so annoyed by it. So what did we do? We actually put out an advisory circular for HR professionals and talent acquisition professionals, and we said, if you are having trouble finding talent, here are 3 things you should consider. First and foremost, get rid of your degree requirements. Simple as that. Get rid of them, eliminate them, and this is, I mean, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but this is what happens with HR professionals. They use them as a crutch. And then the next question that came about was, well, what happens if my hiring manager says I have to have that? You tell them no. You're the HR professional. You're the subject matter expert. Push back, right? And oddly enough, it started to work. We saw people actually engaging in this kind of behavior. In addition, we also asked them to think a little bit more about front-end requirements, to do more about the front-end requirements that you put forth in a job. And what was intriguing is, what percentage of HR professionals do you think actually go to their applicant tracking or their HRIS and just use a template for a job that's put out there? What percentage do you think do that? I hear somebody say 70-something, right? You said 70-something? I wish it was that low. It's actually closer to about 92%. Say that the whole purpose of having an HRIS system is for me to go ahead and be able to just borrow and get that library of jobs. Well, the problem is that's not necessarily tailored to your profession or your industry. And then the other thing is, it's, you know, you're sort of limiting yourself because it's definitions of someone else's definitions of the skill. What good is that going to do you? Then the last thing we sort of highlighted is many people actually assume that if you're going to go ahead and do this work, that you should do it for all of your organization. And this is something that happens repeatedly. We see organizations do this, and they say, well, the problem is if I do this, then I have to do it for every part of the organization. If I get a new HRIS system, then it has to be for the whole organization. And we ask people why. Why don't you just focus on a specific role and try it? I work with a variety of different researchers over the course of my career. I'm on 20 years now, going on 20 years. And one of the things that always strikes me is organizations that are truly successful are the organizations that pilot something, that actually pilot something. Not the ones who say, well, I've got to, it's all or nothing, or I've got to be equitable, or I've got to be, no, just pilot something. Try. It can't hurt to try. And maybe if it does hurt, you learn something anyway, right? So we see that repeatedly, and these are the things that we put out there, and all of a sudden we started to see a change in the frame of mind around talent acquisition professionals. Before you knew it, we saw them asking two things in two different communities for specific changes themselves. They asked us to convene a group of HCM providers, the human capital and HRIS system providers, and they said, please make these changes for us. We want to see something of an industry-wide kind of change here, and we'd love for you to kind of be the first groups to do that. And so they asked us specifically, let's go drop qualifications in your systems. Or better yet, if you're going to put in qualifications, don't tease them apart. I don't need to know if it's a skill. I don't need to know if it's somebody took a course in Excel, or just tell me everything you know. And you heard Amber talk about, tell me everything you know and everything you know how to do. In addition, we then saw that there were a variety of other groups that sort of started to work towards building work samples back into their HRIS system. So show me, if you can't tell me, just show me that you can do something. How do I build a work sample back in? And then the third thing that we saw was, basically we saw that they were coding bypasses for credentials. They were finding ways to build bypasses so that credentials were pulled way up. Help me see the credential more clearly than if I was not there, and if it was just listed in a standard kind of qualifications or interoperable learning record. Help me call that out more clearly. Make it so that it cues me and I understand what it is that I need to be doing. Behavioral cueing was something that HRIS professionals felt would be unethical, and yet their consumers were asking for it. Cue me to do this. Help me see the need to do this. This was what we saw the very first thing happen. Then they asked us to convene job boards. And job boards, talk about interesting, right? That's somewhere where we really started to see some hay. And all of a sudden you saw some job boards are adopting the learner employment record or the interoperable learning record. We also see that some of them are actually thinking a little bit more about behavioral cueing themselves, and then they started building educational programs more specifically for their talent acquisition pros. What was interesting is we then saw somebody actually put investment dollars behind this. How many of you have heard of GoGig? Never heard of GoGig? Well, GoGig is the first job board where it's a marketplace, but it's basically, here are my skills marketplaces, and you don't get to see anything about me other than the skills I have. That's it. Nothing else. And you as an employer are the consumer, not me. I'm just putting my skills out there. You come to me, and I determine whether or not I swipe right or I swipe left once you unveil yourself. It's as simple as that. But it's a group that's actually tackling this and saying skills are the only thing that matters. Forget all the other nonsense. I don't even want to know it. All this really kind of frames itself in one way for me, which is, I think specifically about a guy that I work with. Some of you may have heard of a man, Ram Charan. He's a kind of like a CEO whisperer. He has coached all the Fortune 500 CEOs, or a good portion of the Fortune 100, including Jeff Bezos at the start. And one of the things that stands out is Ram, he wrote the Leadership Pipeline. He highlights the fact that for many people, we always think in the frame of who is my customer or who is my consumer. But what he doesn't really, what he says is the truly successful organizations actually think about three people in that chain. The first person they think about is that customer. then they think about the consumer, and then they think about the end user. And his whole argument is, don't try to tackle the customers or the consumer's needs, tackle the end user's needs. If you handle their needs, that's where you have success. So I'll share with you his example in this, and I actually talked to him before this presentation. One of the things that I asked him to think about was, if you were to thinking about the customer in this room, who's that customer? I've talked to a couple folks over the course of the day, and many of you will say that customer is the learner, right? I had a conversation with Rob, and Rob said the learner is our customer. But who's your consumer? You say the employer, but it's not exactly the employer. It's the HR professional. It's the person who is screening and pushing people forward to that role, right? And for the consumer, that's the person that you have to make the flow of information very easy. Have to make it almost so that there is no lift for that individual. So for them, you're thinking about usability, right? But who is your ultimate end user? It's the leaders of the organizations we all serve, right? Whether you like it or not, a CEO today will tell you that the top issue they run into is they don't have the talent to succeed. Who is your end user? That CEO. You get them the skills, they are the end user. And start with their needs and watch how all the others fall in line. Now, I'm not asking you to think about CEO needs. I'm asking you to think about the organization's needs, right? But that's what you need to do, is apply that frame, especially when you're thinking about HR professionals and how you get beyond just the learner in this frame. I liken this specifically, and this is a tool I use with my, when I used to teach quite a bit. One of the things that always struck me was people assume that HR professionals tackle a problem like it's a puzzle. People assume that employers tackle a problem like it's a puzzle. I have a hole in the puzzle, and I need to fill that hole with the right piece. But that's not the way to do this. It just isn't the way to do this. The way to do this is actually to think about it more like this. We have a collective problem, right? Oh, it's 2 hummingbirds chipping away. I apologize, 2 woodpeckers. But we have a collective problem, and we all need to chip away at it to get a collective solution, right? And that's the way to really approach it. More importantly, when you ask HR professionals the way they operate, this is the way they operate. They want to chip away at a problem. They don't want to fill a gap or solve a puzzle. That's not what they're trying to do. I'll leave you with this one thought here, and I work with a colleague of mine. His name is Johnny C. Taylor Jr. He used to be the CEO of Thurgood Marshall College Fund and now the CEO of SHRM, and a good buddy of mine. We do a lot of work together, a lot of thought work together. And Johnny is fond of saying that the solution to the world's problems is really focusing on the 2 E's, right? The closer we draw the link between the 2 E's, the better. So employment and education. And I'm a scientist by training, so immediately I went and I said, let's go ahead and tackle that. Let's see what HR professionals think when you ask them that. And sure enough, we asked HR professionals, what if we provided you with a skills-based solution or a skills-based hiring solution for yourself, for your organization, what outcomes would you see that would be beneficial to you? And it was interesting because right off the bat, they said I'd have better mental health. I'd have greater access and opportunity to do what it is that I need to do. And I'd be much more resilient and good at what I do. Interestingly enough, we asked these people to tell us what benefits they expected to see, and the majority of them found benefits for themselves, not for their organizations. But if I didn't tell you that, what would you see in terms of those benefits? They're benefits to the organization. And if I didn't tell you it was for the organization and I didn't tell you it was for HR, who would those benefits be for? The worker, the learner, right? So we have an alignment in terms of our outcomes We just don't have that alignment in terms of what our frame for success is and how we approach it, right? And I'll leave you with this one thing I've learned about HR professionals. When push comes to shove, they love themselves. And they love things that make their lives easier. So always keep that in mind. Thank you all. Do we have questions? Amber, did you have any questions? We have time. Yeah, we have a little bit of time. Sure. I see pictures. I think we're good. Okay. Oh, go ahead. Oh, hang on. We got to get you the mic. We're streaming this one out. So.
So I had one question. This is back on one of your slides back there, but you said that they don't care so much about alternative credentials when they're hiring, but they do care about listed competencies. I think it was third.
Yeah.
What do they see as the difference? So is it better for me to list my competency without someone giving me a credential for it than to have a credential for that listed competency?
So the proof is in the pudding, right? What they actually prefer is that you show them that you passed a test that indicates that you have those competencies, but list your competencies anyway. So they want both, is what they really want.
I think I understand what you're saying. I think what it's communicating to me is they don't understand what, and this is kind of what you were saying, but they don't understand what alternative credentials are saying. And we need to do a better job of making that clear, because it seems like the same thing and they don't understand it.
Less than 9% actually do. Less than 9%. You're absolutely right. We had a question over here, gentleman, over there. Hang on, we're going to bring you the mic. Sorry about that.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Really just highlighting for us that we're not imagining, and just telling ourselves that skills-based hiring is a need, and that multiple stakeholders think it's the way to go. I'm curious, when you say that so few, I think you said fewer than 7% of hiring managers are able to actually define the skills for the jobs for which they're going to do skills-based hiring. How does that gap get filled? And is that a SHRM solution? Is there, as people are into badges, are in credentials, is SHRM going to credential organizations in their ability to do skills-based hiring?
So I don't know that it is, in fact, a SHRM solution. I think it's a competitive solution. What I'll share with you is, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with the talent pipeline management kind of program or academy that the Chamber has put together. Well, we're 50-50 partners with them on that. The idea being that they shared with us specifically that they were going to go to small business operators and teach them about skills-based hiring and how you'd leverage that. And we said, you're going to miss the mark on 80% of the HR professionals out there, because small business operators are one subset, but many of them are using HR systems or HR tools or HR providers in some way. So let us join forces. All that to say that we're putting together a solution. Is it going to be successful? I hope. Is it going to be the end-all, be-all? By no means. By no means. But it is an education-based approach. And what's funny is, philosophically, I think we see the idea and how it happens, but when it comes to the actual nuts and bolts and getting it done, the only way we're going to have to be able to do it is exactly the solution you provided, which is to motivate HR professionals, you have to credential them, right? And to motivate small business operators, you have to credential the people that are serving them. And so whether we like it or not, we're going to end up having to credential that audience on skills-based hiring. Okay. Other questions? Anybody else? Thank you for your questions, both of you. I really appreciate it. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Alex. We appreciate you. And wanted to bring this to a close and say thank you. And I hope you had a really good program. Everyone is safe on their way home. Please continue to follow the work of this community, because that's exactly what it is, on imsglobal.org. And mark your calendars for next year around this same time for the upcoming summit, for that summit, and again, follow imsglobal.org to keep in touch with what the community is doing. So thank you all.